Salt marshes are intertidal marine ecosystems that form in areas of reduced oceanic flow, such as in bays and inlets. During periods of low tide, they are exposed to the air, while during high tide they are submerged in salt water. This daily flooding and draining of salt marshes has caused salt marsh plants and animals to become adapted to the challenges of both marine and terrestrial environments. Unlike many terrestrial ecosystems, such as forests, where sediment is geologically deposited or eroded from underlying rocks, salt marshes are built biologically by the organisms that inhabit them. Vascular plants colonize inlets and bays, and over time physically trap sediments from both oceanic and freshwater sources. These plants bind sediments together, and in combination with their decaying below-ground plant matter, slowly build a complex substrate called peat that forms the base of the marsh environment. On the east coast of the United States, where salt marshes are common, the plant responsible for building salt marsh habitat is Spartina alterniflora. Spartina, or cordgrass, initially colonizes the shores of inlets and bays, and once a salt marsh begins to form, it remains on the outer edge of the marsh, constantly binding sediments and pushing the edge of the salt marsh outwards into the ocean. As salt marshes extend further from the coast, wave energy increases, leading to increased erosion at the leading edge of the marsh. Salt marshes are constantly expanding and eroding, creating dynamic and interesting ecosystems. Unfortunately, salt marshes in the United States are seriously threatened by human activity. Historically, dredging and marsh development destroyed and transformed salt marsh habitat, while ditching for mosquito control during the Great Depression altered the hydrology and biology of salt marshes. These threats still persist and are accompanied by new stressors, such as increased nitrogen loads, sea level rise, and pollution. Another threat to salt marshes that remained underappreciated for decades is recreational overfishing. Overfishing has caused catastrophic ecological damage in many marine ecosystems, such as kelp forests and coral reefs. Overfishing affects marine ecosystems by removing top predators, which has a trickle-down effect on the rest of the ecosystem, known as a trophic cascade. A trophic cascade is an ecological phenomenon in which one trophic level, one level in a food chain, undergoes population increases or decreases, which have cascading effects down the food chain. In New England salt marshes, a trophic cascade occurs when populations of predator species, such as striped bass and blue crabs, are greatly reduced due to recreational overfishing. These species play important roles in salt marsh ecosystems, which the Burtness Lab has documented over the last 4 years. These species help maintain and control the populations of many species, including the nocturnal herbivorous burrowing crab, Sisarma reticulatum. Sisarma is a native species, but is typically found at very low numbers in healthy marshes where its predators are abundant. When these predators are removed by recreational overfishing, Sisarma populations explode, increasing up to 400% in the most heavily fished marshes. These increased densities have serious effects further down the food chain. Sisarma are herbivorous crabs and graze almost exclusively on Spartina alterniflora, the cordgrass on the leading edge of New England salt marshes, responsible for binding and trapping sediments. Sisarma grazes on cordgrass leaves above ground and creates complex burrow systems that allow them to feed on cordgrass roots and rhizomes without fear of predation or heat stress. Sisarma grazing and burrowing creates large stretches of bare creek bank with no above-ground or below-ground vegetation, and large Swiss cheese-like burrow complexes. Without cordgrass to hold the substrate together and bind new sediment, serious erosion occurs, and the leading edge of the marsh can retreat several feet per year. The marsh erodes vertically and horizontally, and when large chunks of peat become structurally weakened, they split off into the ocean. This leads to very significant habitat loss at the marsh edge, where marshes are built and where the effects of sea level rise are most strongly felt. When entire swaths of peat are lost, what was once marsh becomes large patches of soft, muddy sediment. On Cape Cod, where the Burtness Lab has done the bulk of its recent research, salt marsh die-off has been occurring since the late 1970s. In the last few years, however, we've seen some interesting examples of cordgrass recovery at die-off marshes. Some grazing by Sisarma is still occurring, but large patches of bare substrate at the marsh edge have become revegetated. The regrowth we're seeing, though, is not in the bare, heavily eroded peat that remains after Susarma grazing and burrowing occurs, but in the soft, muddy sediment that occurs below the eroded peat. The cordgrass regrowth forms long bands parallel to the marsh bank and typically grows right to the border of the heavily eroded peat. The cause for this partial recovery is still not entirely known, but we are currently investigating several possible hypotheses. It might be caused by an increase in Susarma predators, which would reduce Susarma populations and decrease the amount of grazing on cordgrass. It might also be because cordgrass is regrowing into a zone where Susarma cannot graze it. While the lab works on these larger questions, I have been trying to understand the effects and importance